welcome. First of all, I'm going to be introducing our speaker, which is Dr. Dima Faour-Klingbeil. She's a research fellow at the University of Plymouth, and her research basically focuses on food safety throughout the chain, as you know, from farm to fork, as well as she is a consultant, she is an auditor, and basically what she's going to be talking about today, which you already know, is she's going to be covering the FSMA. FSMA is something to us here in Lebanon, something that is still new, and this is why I highly encourage you to take as much information as you can from her. Later on in the course, you're going to be taking as well other information. It's really important that you focus. She's going to be giving us an overview of the FSMA and its implications for imports, exporters, sorry. If you have, please join me in welcoming her, and if you have any questions, can we ask you directly, or they wait?
No, we can do that at the end.
We can do that at the end,
yeah.
Okay? So please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's not working?
It's working. It's working. It's on.
Yeah, great. Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Reem. Thanks for my colleagues who invited me here. It's quite a pleasure to be here. I'm actually on vacation. It's been 3 years I'm not here. So we are supposed to be in a vacation mood. And I got this wonderful opportunity to come to my second home. Spent my BS here, my master's degree here, and a few years of my PhD research were actually conducted in the Faculty of Agriculture Labs and Food Sciences. So I'm very happy to talk about FSMA because this is my work and this is what I do. And it is one of the most discussed topics nowadays, not only in the United States, but actually in Europe, in Middle East, and a lot of other countries in Latin America. And I think, in my opinion, this is actually, FSMA is the only national regulation that echoed internationally. It's really amazing the amount of interest and heightened attention that has been directed towards FSMA because it created confusion in the food industry, even the food professionals who are so much involved in the private standards and they have so much of a background and experience, they actually at some point got confused with what is exactly FSMA and what are the requirements. So the reason why FSMA made this echoing just beyond the territories of the United States, I would say it's food trade, because nowadays we are connected through food trade, globally speaking. So we have transformed our food system. We're changing the way we eat, the way we consume our food, the way we prepare our food. And this is an example. I'm sorry, in my computer it's better. It's actually sharper. But this is a bowl of salad that actually gives you an indication. Not only the salad, any processed food you eat contains several ingredients that come from different sources, different regions, different countries. It becomes extremely complex. But not only this, I have experienced in my audit that I would be actually auditing a company that is packaging a particular brand or product. And that raw ingredient or that product which is packaged is actually coming from another food facility that I have already audited in another part of Northern Europe. And those people, they are sourcing their ingredient from some other also countries. So it's quite a big chain. And the movement of food products are becoming extremely rapid. And so there's an extensive handling, and there is a higher risk for food contamination to be introduced into the supply chain. So basically, we are having this kind of complex network, and this is, supposedly it's also sharper on my desktop. And what you see in the background is a web of food trade, complex. These are 207 countries. And this is taken from a study, a group of researchers. They use the United Nations agri-food data, and with some mathematical ways, they come up with what we say is the International Agri-Food Network. And this network showed there are 7 central countries like Germany, Netherlands, China, and others. They're trading food with 77% of all these 207 countries. So imagine how important it is to know our food source and how important to be capable of tracing in the event of foodborne illnesses, to trace the etiological agent or the strains that is responsible for a major food outbreak. And we can see, if you have heard about this, probably most of you, this is a massive outbreak in Germany, but it did not stay within Germany. It actually traveled and invaded other countries in Europe, causing more than 4,000 people hospitalized or sickened, let's say sick, falling sick because of the E. coli 0104, which is quite pathogenic. But that's not the case only. These figures here, they are probably not representative of the last updated figures, which become actually much more. 50 people die, 4,000 people affected, and some cases where they were captured in USA and Canada. So what does it mean? This is just to relate why food trade is important in food safety, is because any infectious agent can become a big threat for the country as a whole. It started from this spot and it becomes really a big threat. But it's also the food source can travel and disperse quite rapidly. So any local risk is easily transformed into an international risk through food trade. Now the United States, actually, according to the data, there is approximately 15 to 19% of the food consumed in the United States is imported. So this is a load, and this requires a lot of resources, inspections, and control. But that's not only the case. Now, we are quite clear about how food safety challenges are growing and that the foodborne illnesses can become a public health problem. So what triggered FSMA? What is the relation of food trade and all this? What triggered FSMA is the fact that in the United States, the CDC reported that there are 48 million people every year falling sick because of contaminated food. It's quite a high number. But also, there is another big figure, and these are the 3,000 people who die every year also because of eating unsafe food. And this is a right for people to have safe food, and we need to prevent these problems. So in the last years, what happened in the United States, there was 3 major events, and these 3 major events triggered FSMA. So there's always a reason and always a problem that triggered these kind of positive responses. Now, the 3 major events, starting with that one in 2008 or 2009, in that period, this is the Peanut Corporation of America, or American Peanut Corporation. I always make, I don't know the name exactly, but this is a corporation that produced peanut butter in the States. It's very famous. What happened is that they have knowingly sold peanut which is contaminated with salmonella. So this guy knew that his product is contaminated, yet he has requested to ship it to the market. What happened after that? 700 people fell sick, but also a dozen died because of this. Then in 2006, there is an E. coli outbreak, and this is 0157, and it was because of the contaminated spinach. So 200 people fell sick, and this boy is among the people who died because of eating contaminated spinach. And then the other case was, the 3rd event is that the FDA received reports and talking about several thousands of pets dying after consuming pet food. And the pet food, after investigation, were intentionally contaminated in China by melamine. So it's an adulteration of the food. So these 3 were the major event. So following the campaign which were launched in the United States, in the aftermath of this outbreak, President Obama signed FSMA into law, and it becomes one of the most important sweeping reform of the food safety law in the United States. The FDA will call it the historic transition, because this FSMA has actually enabled the FDA to shift their focus into preventing foodborne illnesses and not reacting to it. So basically, how do we understand FSMA? With this very simple structure to start with, the changes are illustrated here through these 5 key aspects of authorities. What does it mean? FSMA have given the FDA additional tools, enforcement authorities which are expanded. So now with the FSMA, FDA has further authorities to ensure that they are requiring across the supply chain the implementation of preventive control measures. We will talk about this in the coming slides. But also, the FSMA has expanded the authority of the FDA, which was not before, to increase inspection beyond the United States. So it's not anymore within the boundary of the United States. Any food facility that process, manufacture, pack, or hold food for human consumption in the United States will be subjected to the inspection of the FDA. And we can see this, in this figure. Between 2009 and 2019, we can see in this period of time, between 2011 and 2019, this is where the FSMA took effect, actually, and how this significant rise in the inspection activity of the FDA outside the United States have increased over time. And this is across the different countries, not only Mexico, or it's even in Europe. So beside these authorities for inspection, for ensuring compliance and increasing compliance rate, the important food safety is also now required to actually meet the US applicable food law. So any food facility outside the United States is required to implement the same food regulation that is expected from the domestic food facilities in the United States. So there is an equivalent requirement for both outside and inside the United States. The FDA have a mandatory recall authority. It means whenever they determined that the food that is coming or that is existing in the local market carry or pose threats to the consumers, they would have this authority to recall the food product from the market. And this is, when we say mandatory recall, it is normally followed with legal actions or some kind of financial liabilities. And partnership is very important. Under FSMA, there is more support and there is more reinforcement of collaboration among the government, because the FDA is required and is responsible for a number and dozens of regulations and guidance for the industry. And that requires a lot of collaboration between the different local governments, between the academics, and the FDA. Now, I would like just to hint something, because this is related to FSMA. There is a difference between USDA and FDA. When we speak FSMA, we're speaking of the changes that affected the FDA authorities over the food that falls under its responsibility, and not USDA. The difference is the FDA regulates all food products that are beyond the regulatory authority of USDA, which are the meat, poultry, and egg product. Everything else fall under the authority and the jurisdiction of the FDA. So when we speak FSMA, we're talking about the changes in FDA authorities, and we're talking about the food products that are covered by the FDA, all right? So the USDA, because this have made confusion in the food industry, there were many questions, and so much of this kind of confusion between both. So now, this is the supply chain, and what are the 7 rules? What does it mean, 7 rules? The FDA is responsible for 50 regulations, guidance, and studies, but there are 7 basic ones, which are spanning across the supply chain, starting from the farm, ending in the fork. And these are the fresh produce safety rule. So starting from the farm, there is the preventive approach to control all the activities taking place here, and this is by the requirement to implement science-based standard for harvesting, growing fresh produce. And then we have the sanitary regulation. So now we started from the primary. Now the sanitary, the transportation, is also controlled through this regulation, which control food products from cross-contamination, controlling temperature during transportation, personal training, all the conditions that are necessary to keep food during transportation safe. The third-party accreditation rule, this is the third. So out of 7, we have now the third one is the third-party accreditation. This relates to your question, Iman. This is a voluntary program. It means the food importers have a voluntary program to apply for this regulation or to actually follow this regulation. It describes the requirement for the accreditation of third-party certification body to audit the food facility, to certify them, and to certify their food product. It means any food importers that is approved by this regulation, he will have facilitated inspection and sampling of his imported goods. So it gives an expedited review for his conditions, because in that way, FDA is actually focusing on their resources more effectively towards higher risk areas. The Foreign Supplier Verification program, this is a regulation that does not apply to foreign facilities. It is strictly covering US importers. Any importer sitting in the United States are required to follow this regulation. What does it mean this? We cannot discuss this in details in 50 minutes, but this is in general, meaning the US importer is required to verify food producers in other countries that they are following and meet the requirement of the United States food law. So he is responsible to make sure any food product that's coming in is coming from a food facility that is respecting the requirement of the United States food regulation. It's a very interesting way of holding responsibility and accountability for the importers and for the producers. And by this, they are effectively managing the resources of the FDA. They're not anymore relying on the end product sampling, which is not effective. And then we have, this is our actually talk, which we will focus on it later. This is the 2 preventive control rule. I will start with this one, the preventive for human food rule. Now, this is a shortened name of the regulation. This is actually what we say, the GMP, hazard analysis, and risk-based preventive control regulation. It's quite long, but we call it here preventive control. This is broadly and generally applied to many food facilities inside the United States and outside. They are covered by this rule. They are required to implement and to ensure that they are actually implementing the GMP, the hazard analysis, and determining the preventive control for human food. If the facility is processing animal food, then this is the same requirement for animal food. If the food facility is processing a human food, but the byproduct is being used for animal food, then they're required to actually follow both regulations. And then we have the last one, which will be due if actually the compliance is due in 2020. It will be taking effect in 2020, and the inspection of the FDA for this will also take effect in the coming year, and this is the intentional adulteration rule. That means is every food facilities, domestic or international, that process, manufacture, pack, or hold food, they are required to have a defense plan, to have mitigation strategies to prevent intentional contamination of the food inside the facility or outside, wherever the outside, if they have these kind of large vessel storage or storage for food, liquid. So there should be this kind of mitigation strategy to protect any potential intrusion of people or a group of people to intentionally contaminate the food. So these are the 7 rules. And it's always important for the food industry to remember if they fall and if they are covered by this preventive control rule. It depends on the product which they produce, and it depends on what kind of processing is taking place in that facility. But generally, this is the most applicable, which we're going to talk about it today. So what do we expect, or what the food facility outside the United States expect when they want to export to the United States their food product? First of all, it's important for any food facility that fall, or that they process food that falls under the authority of the FDA, is that they do register with the FDA, because it is actually under their authorities. So you need to register, and there is this kind of electronic registration way where food industries have guidance how to do that. It's all on the FDA website. And whether the agent, the owner of the food business, or the operator, they are required to register their facilities. But also they have to renew, and this is the amendment which took place, is the renewal of their registration every 2 years, because this will actually serve for updating their database, for having accurate information, to be able to respond efficiently in the case of food recall, so they have this information very updated. But not only this, during the registration, there is a lot of information that is required to be given. And this is also one of these kind of amendment that has been included, is to give what kind of activities the food facility is doing, what kind of food category they're producing, and many other information that is available on their website. The FDA has also been given and enabled to have the authority to suspend registration of food facility should they determine under certain circumstances that there is some kind of threat, or the food product is actually posing threat for the consumer health. Now, these are not going to go through it, but in general, who are not required to register with the FDA? These are restaurants, retail establishments, farms, and retailers, so transport vehicles. In general, what we have just said about the food that is covered by the FDA, those food facilities are required to register with this regulatory body. So the other important requirement is once the facility is registered, they should have a US agent in the United States. And that was a mistake which have been actually happening with some clients. They are startup companies, they're not aware of this requirement. So they registered and they shipped their product, but they didn't have a US agent. And their product actually did not enter the border, and they have to be shipped back to Germany. It's quite a long way and cost. So this information, although we're saying it in the presentation, there are food companies that they are not still aware of this little information, and sometimes there is a little bit of confusion still. The US agent is any person who is residing in the United States or who has a legal business entity in the United States. And they should actually be there, living there, not like an answering machine or someone who's not all the time there. And this is important because the FDA would require to contact the person and get in touch with them for emergency reasons when there is major outbreaks, investigations happening, recall, which is mandatory. They need to contact the person, and this is the US agent on behalf of the food producer. They will not contact the one who's sitting in China immediately or the one who's sitting in Lebanon. So, but they are also a route of communication in the case of organizing and arranging food inspections. The FDA would schedule inspection with the US agent, and he is required to arrange all this information and make sure that the FDA is settled in that particular issue. So we finished the registration, the US agent, and now the food facility knows that they are falling under the jurisdiction of the FDA. We are producing food that the FDA is regulating. So basically, we are likely to be covered under this regulation, which I've said. It's called the Current Good Manufacturing Practices, Hazard Analysis, and Risk-Based Preventive Control for Human Food. For shortening it, I will keep calling it as a preventive control rule. And what does it mean this? It means the food facilities are required to have a food safety plan. By regulation, by the preventive control rule, each food facility should have a food safety plan. And the food safety plan is required to cover the following components, these following components. Now, it's a big difference between when you say HACCP and food safety plan, and the difference lies in this, what I'm gonna explain in this moment. So the food safety plan have basically a document that include the hazard analysis. Everyone knows the hazard analysis, but the hazard analysis has to include the identification of known and foreseeable hazard, or reasonably foreseeable hazard, meaning it really depends on every facilities what could be the potential hazards, depending on your formula, depending on the design of your equipment, your sanitary condition, your staff, your different type of food which is processed in the same plant, in the same line, how many line of production line you have in the facility. So there are a number of factors that affect the identification of the hazard. And then, based on the hazard analysis and the significance of the hazard, the food facility should determine what kind of preventive control they should actually have in place. The preventive control could be process control, and this is what you know as CCP, the critical control point. These are the process control points that are within your process, that where you monitor your parameters, where you monitor your temperature, for instance, or the pH, or other factors. And then also depending on your risk assessment, your preventive control, it could be the allergen. If you are a facility that produce different food product with different allergen profile, you are required to, based on your risk assessment, to consider having what we call allergen preventive control. And then we have the sanitation preventive control. These are not GMPs. These are practices that are similar to these sanitary practices or the sanitation in your GMP, but they are elevated to become extremely critical to be monitored as a preventive control. And then we have the supply chain program. If food facility identify hazards that are significant and that they cannot control it within their processing, they are required to have a supply chain program to control the hazard in the supply chain before it comes to the consumers or before they produce it to the consumer. And then the other requirement is to have a recall plan when they identify a hazard that required control. So the food safety plan is really different than the HACCP. The HACCP, what you know, is restricted to the processing place. It does not go beyond and does not span across the supply chain, not from the source and not until your consumers. You are restricting your control on that particular area. So, and this is quite a common mistake. We know, and I have actually met with many companies, and they have called, and they always said, we have a team of professional HACCP trained professionals, and we are certified by IFS, by BRC, and they are internationally everywhere. But somehow the US importer have required, because he's required by the regulation to verify their activity, he asked that you need to have PCQI, Preventive Control Qualified Individual in your facility in order to import your food to the United States. And they're wondering what is a PCQI? And we said that they have to have a food safety plan. And it's different than HACCP. But it's important to always confirm and emphasize that FSMA, or the preventive control rule, which we're talking about now, is based on the same food principles, food safety principle we're talking about. There is a big section of HACCP that we rely on also. And we have also the same terminologies and the same parameters and values. So we are not changing the principle that you have learned, or they are not changing the principle they have learned. They are rather expanding this control. They are having this oversight over this long chain, and this is extremely interesting. They take it all the way until the product is packed. I'll give you an example. When you're producing food which is open to the environment, you're processing food which is not packed, ready to eat, pizza. It's ready to eat, and it's coming in the line, open to your environment. There is no HACCP here or critical control point. Your critical control point is already probably in your oven. I don't know, it depends on the process. We cannot now come up with some scenarios. But in our mindset, the FSMA, this product is exposed to potential contamination from the environment. Therefore, you need to have a preventive control, which we call sanitation preventive control. Someone needs to monitor the sanitation activity, whether it's activity, process, procedure. But someone has to verify the effectiveness of that control point in that particular area. And you need to actually verify it through probably environmental monitoring, looking for potentially contaminated area with pathogens, depending on the facility also. So this is how it goes more into becoming extremely protective for any potential contamination from the environment, because it's not packed. Now, if it is packed, it's a GMP. You don't anymore think of a preventive control in that area. So that's the difference between the HACCP. Preventive control human food. This is the this is the regulation, which is GMP, hazard analysis, and risk-based preventive control regulation. We call it preventive control for human food. It's just the shortened name. The GFSI scheme, these are the BRC standard, the private standard that are actually falling under this umbrella. The IFS, ISO 22, no, ISO 22 is not the GFSI, sorry to correct. So we're talking about private standards that rely on HACCP in their food safety management system and on the prerequisite, which are the GMPs. And we're trying to explain what is the difference between these two. At the end of the session, we can continue further the discussion. So once you have the food safety plan and your preventive control are determined, you're required to have a documentation of those. But I want to go back a little bit here. If you can see this GMPs and prerequisite program, which you all are familiar with, they're not required to be within your documentation of your food safety plan. They are definitely needed. They are important. The more your GMP is robust, the less are your preventive control. Yeah, so basically, you need to have these, but they're not requiring to have documentation except for training. Training is a required document it's an FDA mandatory requirement. So once you have all this in place, the FDA is scheduling an inspection probably based on the risk. They assess what kind of food they have, ranking as higher risk, and they would inspect, and you know they're coming. What should they do? They actually could do, we cannot say this or this or this, but there is really a wide variety of possibilities where they would look at, but normally they will definitely go into observing thoroughly your process flow, how your processing activity is taking place, and they will ask and look at your validation if your process is actually validated. And if you are monitoring your parameters, how frequent is your monitoring? Are you monitoring this frequently? Who's monitoring? Is he trained on monitoring those parameters? Because this is important. But also, the use of equipment, you're using equipment to verify your system. Are they calibrated? Are they accurate? They look into these kind of areas. And allergen control is definitely one of the most important area that they wouldn't overlook, because for the FDA, allergen control has taken quite a very important and substantial discussion in our training, because 40% of food recall in the United States is because of allergen, either undeclared allergen or mislabeling for allergen. So if the food facility is dealing with products that has different allergen profile, or they contain allergen, which are among the big 8 allergen in the regulation, they would come and see what kind of control you are in place. Did you put a proper prevention for cross-contact? Are your employees well trained to avoid contaminating the product with allergen, and etc. Cleaning and sanitation training documents for every person. You have qualified individuals who are trained on their job. You need to have record and documentation. And corrective action, if there was corrective action, have you taken action? Have you documented this problem to prevent recurrence, root cause analysis, all these issues you know from other systems? This is also an area of focus for the FDA. I have taken some of the inspection citations from the data dashboard of the FDA. The FDA, I mean, it is really amazing the enormous information that are available for us as food safety professionals and for the food industry. There is no, in my opinion, regulation that have provided this tremendous amount of information and guidance. They are in continuous offering and publishing for guidance for the industry, manuals, how to follow, how to implement the regulation, how to ensure compliance, training. Sometimes you have online training, free online, others are for a very economic price. So there is, it's quite a very impressive, let's say, work. And one of these are these data, warning letters, inspection outcomes. They publish it, you know, the name of the companies, the kind of product, what was the mistake. So you can really understand the trend, understand the pitfalls, and try to actually follow and make sure that you're not doing these kind of mistake. This is an example of what they have published as a result of their inspection for some of the facilities. And you can see that they actually focus on the number of instruments, if they are adequate to monitor and to control the potential hazard, and if they are having a proper precautions to avoid contamination. So they look at all these areas, but they also look if the employees are trained. It's coming in the next slide, sorry, this wasn't new. So here, the sanitary operation, did they maintain it in a clean and sanitary condition? Did they keep it in a good repair? Because when your instruments or your machines or your equipment are not in good repair, this gives kind of like a potential contamination niche for microbiological hazards. And these are also a set of description of what the FDA has been looking on in their inspection and reporting what kind of failure or what kind of pitfalls they have discovered. So they're giving you, and they're giving the food facilities an exposure to where they should focus and how to avoid any potential or critical failure in their systems. Now, within this regulation, the preventive control regulation, it's required that food facilities have what we call the PCQI, the preventive qualified individual, preventive control qualified individual. And he is doing actually, or she's doing a particular functions according to the requirement. And that is the preparation of the food safety plan, which we discussed. So either they oversee or they prepare the food safety plan, validation of the process based on scientific information, scientific data, or even trials and experiments. Determine if the validation is not required, they should provide justifications. Verification, and the verification activity is the main function of a PCQI. So there is also a time frame to do the verification activity within 7 days. Otherwise, there has to be a justification why not in 7 days, depend on what kind of verification activity the PCQI is doing. It could be environmental monitoring that requires waiting time for the laboratory result. Reanalysis of the food safety plan is also one of the major functions of a PCQI. So how do we have this? Who is the PCQI and how can we become PCQI is actually, according, it's quite a big definition, but you can take seconds to read it. This is very typical with the FDA regulation that every definition is quite long, but we can see it says PCQI is a qualified individual who has successfully completed training in development and application of risk-based preventive control. It means of this preventive control regulation. At least equivalent, the training should be at least equivalent to that received under a standardized curriculum recognized by the FDA. It means, what does it mean, the standardized curriculum? Is the training curriculum that the Food Safety Preventive Control Alliance, this one, the Food Safety Preventive Control Alliance. This is an alliance of regulatory officials, researchers, academics. They have come up with this amazing manual. It's a whole 16-module training of more than 500 pages that include all the different requirements for this preventive control rule to help the PCQI in understanding how to prepare a food safety plan, how to put it into implementation. And they would certify the PCQI based on the successful completion of this course. This is the curriculum which is recognized by the FDA as adequate. But when they said in the definition, any other training that at least equivalent to this one, so far there is no training that's equivalent to what the FDA has recognized. And that's why we see a number of people always interested in becoming PCQI by getting this kind of FSPCA training course. So of course, or otherwise they could be qualified through experience. If they can show their ability to understand the US regulation and implementation through experience, that's excellent. It's not mandatory to have a training, but you need to show this through a proper and effective implementation during the inspection. Now, Another important regulation that is applied for the domestic, the US food facilities and the international food facility is the defense plan. And this is a regulation that's very important to put mitigation strategies to control any potential intentional contamination of your food. And that is actually done through a series of requirements. The food facilities are required to assess the different vulnerabilities points. There are some points and vulnerabilities depend on every facility, how big, how small, how expanded the territory is, and how many buildings they have. There are points where they could be vulnerable for some accessibility of people, group of people, or even from within the staff to intentionally contaminate the food. I think you have heard probably of this famous Australian strawberry that were sold in the market with needles inside of them. So these are intentional. I don't think strawberry grow with needles. Someone has put them there. And once they identify those vulnerability points, they need to determine systems or procedure to mitigate these and to prevent those advantages of taking advantage of those points, and to have a procedure to monitor and train the people who are monitoring and try to make sure that there is a corrective action procedures in place that is documented, verification activity system like with the hazard analysis which we were talking about, or with the preventive control measures. We need to monitor and verify our system and ensure there is documented training for our staff. So it's a series of requirements. Probably I have missed also talking about the importance of monitoring, verification, and corrective actions in the previous regulation, because in the preventive control rule, it's required for every preventive control to be monitored continuously and to be verified, and then to have a corrective actions that is particular to that preventive control. So who is covered under this regulation is also covered for the international facilities. And these are normally all the facilities that manufacture, process, hold, or pack food for human consumption. And in general, all the facilities that are required to register with the FDA, they are required to start preparing for the food defense plan, which will take place and will be actually due for compliance in 2020. And farms, retail establishments are exempted, like they are also exempted from the preventive control rule. It applies to international and foreign facilities, but some exemptions and modified requirements apply to small facilities. So there is always, for small facilities or small size facilities, exemption from this regulation and the preventive control rule regulation, which I haven't mentioned before. Also, it is required under this rule to have a qualified individual to make sure that they prepare the food defense plan. And there is now also a training that is being prepared, and lead instructors that are also getting trained to deliver this training also for the food facility, to start having this food defense qualified individual based on this requirement of the standardized curriculum training. So it is not mandatory to have the FSPCA, the standardized curriculum, to become a food defense qualified individual, but it's being prepared to provide the information that is needed under this regulation through the FSPCA, the Food Safety Preventive Control Alliance. And if the individual is capable of performing this function based on his job experience, that's also fine, as long as you can prove and you can demonstrate your understanding of the US regulation. The final requirement for the food facilities to export food to the United States is actually to notify the FDA before the import of food or before the food is actually reaching the port of entry. It is required that they submit a prior notification, and the time frame, it depends on the route or on the shipment route of the product. So if it's going through highways, they will need to give 2 hours prior notice. If they're going through the ocean, it will give 8 hours. And this is important because the notification will allow the FDA to be alerted what kind of food products are coming, which is the source, because it will allow them and serve for a prompt response in the case of emergencies or food outbreak, or even if there is any report of a major threat from that particular article or that particular producer. There are several tools that, like any other regulation, if you go to the FDA site, there are a lot of information for the food industry and professionals to understand how to do every requirement. This is a requirement, and there are several tools to teach and tutorial how to do that. The requirement for the regulation for the preventive control rule, there are also a number of guidance that also teach and guide the food industry in the implementation and the compliance. So basically, we finished our presentation by the prior notice here, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask me now for a nice discussion over FSMA. Thank you.